Hello, welcome everyone to the IPP web conference, Auditing Consent, Essential Strategies for Improving Consent Compliance in 2024, sponsored today by Transcend. My name is Selena, Programming and Speaker Coordinator here at the IPP, and I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started shortly, but before we do, a few quick details. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide IPP certified privacy professionals who are the named registrants with 1 CPE credit. A recording of this program and a copy of the slides will be available in your My IPP account under the My Purchases and My Recordings tab within 48 hours of the webinar's end. Feel free to post any questions you have today for the panelists in the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen. We are greatly looking forward to today's conversation. And with that, I will now hand it over to our moderator, Cameron Ivy, to begin the program.
Thank you very much, Selena, and welcome everybody. As Selena mentioned, my name is Cameron Ivy. I'm going to be your tour guide today with some of these experts that I have. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Obviously, we're going to be covering auditing consent, some essential strategies for improving consent compliance in 2024. So let's go ahead and introduce you to some of my expert speakers. We have Jamal and Sean. Jamal, if you want to go ahead and just tell the listeners just a brief little detail about yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamal Ahmed. I am a global privacy practitioner and I've been fortunate enough to deliver privacy solutions to customers across 6 continents now in all sorts of jurisdictions. So when it comes to consent and getting things right and some of those challenges, I've probably faced most of them and figured out a way to overcome them. I've got all the IAPP certifications, Certified Information Privacy Professional over Europe, Information Manager, Privacy Technologist. So I'm in a really good place to have a good conversation about this and take some good questions. And of course, I'll be co-steering this with our good friend, Sean.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamal. And Sean?
Yeah, really happy to be here. I'm Sean. I've been working at Transcend for over 2 years now, and I am the product lead for our consent and preference solutions. So have a deep background both in the marketing technology space, but also on the regulatory front, helping our customers and our team internally unpackage and understand the various regulatory challenges our customers face, and then making sure that our solutions are not just kind of on our back foot as a status quo, but that we're trying to understand where the regulators are driving and where the needs of the marketing industry are driving as well, to make sure that we are across all of the interesting challenges in this space that is ever evolving, as we'll talk more about today. Nothing is ever static in the world of consent. So plenty to talk about. Really excited for today's session.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. And real quickly, before we get into the agenda of today, I just want to open it up a little bit with both of you. We'll go with Jamal first. What is one thing that you've been binging or streaming right now that you're kind of obsessed with?
What have I been binging or streaming that I'm obsessed with? I would say probably privacy podcasts, right? So I've been binging them. I've been listening to you and Gabriel as well. Just trying to get some good ideas for some more topics on our Privacy Pros podcast, find some more guests that bring that unique perspective. So that's probably what I've been binging on right now.
I love that. That's a craft right there. You're trying to master your craft. I love it. Sean, what about you? Any cool shows, movies, podcasts?
Oh man, I have one daughter and I have another child on the way, and so there has not been much binging other than parenting on my side of the world. I think the closest I've gotten is I recently re-listened to an interesting, fun sci-fi series of audiobooks by Pierce Brown called Red Rising, and just something to keep my head in a different space. It's fun to go out to that fictional world. But other than that, I get enough time binging the privacy world in the day-to-day, keeping up with our regulatory updates. So it's a fun question to kick it off, though, Cameron.
What about you, Cameron?
Me?
Yeah.
I get into some podcasts myself. I like Last Podcast on the Left to talk, just something that gets outside the norm. It talks about like mysteries and murders and things like that. And like history, things of, whatever, like the Black Plague story was really interesting to listen to. And then shows I'm into right now, House of Dragon, finally got into that, which is pretty awesome. and then some other things, but there's just too many things out there. I did see Dune Part 2, which was an epic movie theater experience. So if you haven't seen it yet, I would recommend it as a great experience. But with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So today we're going to talk about auditing consent. I think it's been around for a while. We understand what that is and the basics, but we want to really dig deeper into it. We want to talk about the importance of it in today's world, some of the need to haves, but also going beyond basic consent management. We're going to talk a little bit about real world stories, some of the real world cases that you probably are aware of with some of the, Facebook, Amazon, things like that. We're going to talk about strategies and benefits of an effective consent auditing, and then we'll go over some Q&A at the end. So let's go ahead and dive in to our first slide. Gentlemen, what is auditing consent? I think there's a lot of ways that we can go into this, but I'll start with Jamal. What are some of the challenges that you see from your end today with auditing consent?
Yeah, so when it comes to auditing consent, it's one of those areas where there's always challenges. And the reason for that is because things are so fast moving. So there's 7 key areas that I've kind of highlighted where we've seen lots of challenges and we have to get involved. Number one is that it's just complicated. The complexity of the consent mechanisms. We need to understand that we are actually dealing with businesses who have really complex digital ecosystems. And that makes it really difficult to challenge and track and manage that consent effectively. And there's also such a variety of consent mechanisms. You've got cookie banners, you've got opt-in systems, you've got opt-out systems. And then when you look at the different jurisdictions, they all have different standards. So that makes it very complicated. Number 2 is the lack of kind of like a standardized approach. There is an absence of a universally accepted standard for consent mechanisms, which then leads to inconsistencies and confusions. And then when you start signing up, working with vendors from different parts of the world, it all gets very, very complicated. And then you have different regulations that we have to think about. So the GDPR has its own standards on consent. CCPA has some required. And all of these things come together to complicate that consent management, especially for global organizations. Number 3, I would say, is the technological limitations. So there's technological challenges when it comes to implementing those consent mechanisms in a way that's user-friendly, but you need to balance that with being legally compliant. And most of the time we see clients either get it legally compliant or get it user-friendly. And what we're looking for, or what's challenging, is getting that balance. So what we want to do is find a way where we can actually integrate that consent management systems across the various platforms and technologies in a way that's user-friendly, but also make sure that we're doing the right thing when the regulators come to have a look as well. Number 4, I would say, is getting the actual user to understand what it is that we're asking them for permission for and building their trust. So it's difficult in making sure that users fully understand what they're consenting to. And then if they don't really understand, could you really argue that that consent is actually valid? So what we need to do is explore the impact of that user trust on the consent practices, and especially when we go later on and have a look at some of those high-profile data breaches that we'll be looking at. There's always challenges, number 5, with auditing and enforcement challenges, the practical challenges in actually auditing those consent practices. Who has consented? What did they actually consent to? How long is that consent valid for? Has anything changed in the way we're using the data since that consent was granted? When do we actually have to go back and refresh that consent? How long is it actually valid for? So there's so much there when it comes to the actual auditing enforcement challenges. Number 6, I would say, is the legal, but the ethical standards too. So when we look at it, we can see that there is a rapid change in the legal standards. One day you have new jurisdiction coming out with a global standard here, then you have someone introducing something in another part of the world. And when you have a multinational corporation, it's very difficult for them to manage those things, especially when they have multiple websites and multiple technologies in different parts of the world serving different segments of their clientele. So all of that can really make things really challenging. But what we need to understand is different cultures, different places will also have different societal expectations. Like privacy isn't a standard that goes across everywhere. Different societies, different countries, different audiences will have their own understanding of what's acceptable and how much control they want and what they think is actually pretty cool. So we need to consider the ethical dimensions of that consent, including any power imbalance between the actual data collector and the individuals. And that gets really interesting when you start having a look at some of the different organizations that are actually relying on consent. And then finally, number 7, I would say, is actual lifecycle management. It gets very complicated managing consent through that data lifecycle, all the way from collection right the way through to the end where we actually have to delete it. And there's lots of challenges in ensuring that consent is respected, but also reflected in all of the data processing activities, especially when you've got people coming in multiple times from multiple devices. So it can get really challenging. But I know Sean has got some great solutions that he's been working on to address some of these challenges.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, because that's right on the nose, right, Jamal? There's this wide range, and I love the 7 that you just highlighted of activities that can help audit consent. And I think about, as I was listening to you, I think about how there's a range of cadences associated with those activities. So there's some audit type activities that can be more periodic, more processized, to say, like, are we going to do a quarterly or biannual check-in to make sure that the regulations haven't drifted or changed too much from, what our collection UI was, or our usage practices are. And you can build those sorts of checks into your cycle of how you run your privacy program over the course of a year. I think where we see some of the most pain and where we see some of the most challenge with our customers in the industry more broadly is on the activities that should be more frequent, that are causing a lot more friction in the org. And I think it's important to think about auditing the way you will be audited, right? Because that's the goal here, right? What do we mean when we audit? Well, of course, we should be centered on that end user experience, and we should care as practitioners about the experience our customers and end users are getting. But there's a very real reality that a large part of the activity here is the goal is to make sure that you're not blindsided by a letter from an attorney general or by a regulator reaching out, or by a plaintiff's class action suit that says, hey, if you didn't already know, which you probably should have known, you're doing this thing and you shouldn't be doing it, right? That's not the way any of us wants to find out about a consent challenge. And the thing that makes this ongoing kind of regular cycle of a technical audit important is that implementations drift. So I think a theme you'll hear through today is that just because you set something up in a certain way on your site and on day 0, it's working, right? You've tested it, it's gone through QA, you've got it. Your tag manager is set up, you know what tags are firing. Like, the nature of the modern web stack, the modern marketing stack. I mean, I am kind of focusing a little bit here, as you hear, on web consent, on that area, because it is one of the most rapidly changing areas of your consent program. Not to say that the others are less important, but it's one of the ones that's the hardest to keep up with. And so what we often find with customers is they'll be like, yeah, we did the program, we set it up, well, how long ago was that? 6 months, 8 months, 12 months? And you go check the site or run an audit on the site using an automated audit tool, and you'll find that 1 in 5 sessions, 1 in 4 sessions, cookies are getting dropped by 6 different scripts, and tags are firing that shouldn't be firing. And there's this drift in their implementation. A lot of consent managers kind of rely on you keeping a fairly rigid list in your tag manager that corresponds to what your CMP, your consent manager, is doing. And if there's change in that, due to just normal changes in your program, that can lead to these edge cases. And those aren't hard for end users and regulators to find. This isn't an area where anyone is just going to get by on it being obscure, right? This is an area where it's quite easy, as we've seen from the waves of attorney general letters and the waves of end users realizing cookies are being set that shouldn't be set, that visiting a website with a GPC signal on, if you're worried about the US context, or in the in the EU in an opted out state, and then seeing what's happening on that site is relatively trivial from a technical standpoint. So there isn't this kind of black box barrier of obscurity that maybe in years past some have kind of mentally relied on, to be like, oh yeah, maybe it's not working perfectly, but we won't get caught. That era is over, right? We see lots of interest and inquiry from regulators and enforcement bodies in this area. So I think when we think about auditing consent as a topic, I think what we suggest is that if you are relying on a periodic manual process that doesn't match the speed with which your web implementation or marketing implementation is changing, you are giving yourself visibility gaps. And you just have to weigh that, right? Everything as a privacy practitioner is weighing the risk. There are unclosed risks and unaddressed risks all the time in all of our programs. We all know that. No one has a perfect bulletproof program. It's just doing that calculus for your business to decide what you want the size of that gap to be before your next pass addresses it. So, this isn't a technical solutions demo or anything. We won't go into the weeds, but that's why when we talk about technical auditing solutions that automatically visit your site and run an opted out state, run as a browser agent in different, in different regions and see what's happening and look at the meat of the network traffic. That's why that's sort of a regular ongoing view that's ported back to you, separate from your consent manager implementation, right? Your consent manager can't see certain things, right? You need kind of that other look to say like, okay, but if a user agent from just outside is just visiting that page, what is that experience? So that's where we see the demand really coming from on the technical audit front.
Yeah, that's good stuff, Sean. I kind of want to dig in before we move on to the next slide. I want to dig in a little bit more, just in case anyone listening this might relate to. But when it comes to you talking about the importance of an automated solution, why do you think organizations still struggle with still choosing to manually do this? Why do you think that's still a challenge?
I think there's a variety of reasons. Some of them are predictable, right? It's just process the way process is, or justifications that sometimes having those conversations internally opens the door to, well, what are we going to see? Are we going to like what we see? If we're not going to like what we see, why are we doing this? Why don't we just kind of patch it up and not get an audit tool? There's the unknown unknowns are sometimes nicer than what people are worried they'll find. I think generally what we actually find is that getting the visibility is just a much better state, because then, one, obviously you can't fix, you can't measure, you can't improve what you don't know about. But two, I think generally most people would find that it is a better conversation starting point with a regulator, with someone who's talking to you, to be like, hey, yep, we're on it. We've seen this. This is how we're closing that gap. This is the delta. This is the directional way we're moving. Like looking like you're on top of your program and you understand where you have gaps is always better than being flat-footed and just being like, oh, hey, that's interesting. We hadn't looked at the marketing scripts on our website in 2 years. So I think that's kind of that's some of the internal the internal getting over that hump. I think it's also just a resource thing. People aren't sure how to do it, or what tools to use, or do they need engineering time, right? A lot of orgs, engineering time can be really hard for privacy practitioners to get a hold of, which is why I think, again, solutions, external third-party solutions that can help on that front can help take some of that lift off. It's just a conversation.
Yeah, I think just to chime in there, the other challenge that I see is, especially around Europe, was, yes, so GDPR was coming in, everyone got really nervous about what's going on their website, and they took this really tick box compliance view to it. Okay, we need a tool that does this, or we need to manually do this. Okay, we've done it. Let's write the cookies notice up, and let's just make sure we have a consent banner, or let's adopt the IAB TCP framework and see what happens with that. And everyone that's been following what's been going on, we all know what's happening with the IAB framework. But then with some of the other tools, yes, you might have ticked the box, but what we're realizing now is actually it's not really fit for purpose, or it's not helpful in the pragmatic way that we need to. And Cameron, you and your tribe, or the marketing team, right? You guys don't wait around. Like, you see something, you're innovative, you go and make changes, you see a new tool, you just want to do things faster, quicker, and better than the competition. And you don't really think about coming and speaking to us all the time and saying, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Is it something we can do? And one of the reasons why that might be is because, Sean mentioned the resources. Our teams are always usually under-resourced, right? And so for us to come back to you would mean that you lose that speed of execution. And that's what the marketers are in. So they're always making changes, making updates, making tweaks. And oftentimes they're not even thinking this is a conversation that I need to go and have with the privacy team. And I think sometimes that can get overlooked.
Yeah. The thing I'd add, I saw we had a question come in, Cameron, around, so what does the tooling actually look like to do this? And I think without going into, without going into too much of the technical detail, I think there's a range from being like, at the most simple level, this can be someone in their web browser who knows enough about kind of the way their browser console works to be like, hey, I visited the site and opted out, and kind of going through and manually looking at the cookies that are getting stored into local storage and the network traffic that's firing. That certainly is a more heavy lift. Like, you have to know what you're doing. You have to have, someone on your team, whether that's marketing or engineering, who understands how to do that in a browser console. The much more simple or automated solution is to use tooling to do it. So Transcend, for example, we have we call Web Auditor that does this in scheduled automated basis where we visit the site externally and simulate different regions and experiences, run the GPC signal, and then provide back out, a templated report that shows scripts and cookies and activities that are happening that probably shouldn't be happening given the user's opt-out or consent state. Something like that is a manual report that can be documented in your process and be saying, look, we get this regular view that's separate from the way that we just kind of try to scan and track cookies for setting up a consent program, right? Because that's kind of the thing. It's like, it's a different point of view. It's triangulate. It's showing that you've tried to put yourself in a user seat in addition to the core seat of setting up the practice, which sometimes is, with other consent solutions, often is a static periodic cookie scan, which has its own challenges, right? If you're relying on your most up-to-date information being the fact that OneTrust or whoever is visiting your site every month or sometimes every couple months and scanning 20 pages, and your marketing team is spinning up product-specific landing pages as they go into a new market, or has tools that they've added beyond a login page that external tracker isn't getting to, or has hidden pages that they're indexing in there's all sorts of ways that falls apart. So having a couple layers of a technical solution with a partner with expertise on the front, right? So again, not here to pitch our products too hard, but I am a product manager. I'm really proud of our product. So there's a lot. Let's just say there's a lot you can be doing from a technical standpoint to automate some of this. But at the end of the day, it's not a black box, right? You can validate this with enough expertise going in yourself, which goes back to my first point, which is that this isn't rocket science to the point where an attorney general or a regulator, or a savvy plaintiff putting a case together can't figure out how to go check this stuff, which is why we have to be on top of it as practitioners as well.
Yeah, and also just to add to that, the European Data Protection Board actually released a tool recently, which is available on their website. So anyone can actually go and get that tool, scan any website, compare that to what they have or haven't been asked to consent to. And it doesn't really take much. And one of the things that you'll realize, or one of the things that you might have read, is insurance companies, the biggest concern right now they have isn't cybersecurity, which it was last year. It's actually privacy. And what they're worried about is these lawsuits about all of these pixels dropping and stuff. And so I'm sure there's a slide coming up that talks about some of the benefits. But also, yeah, there could be benefits from an insurance cost point of view when it comes to risk as well. But this is on the forefront of the insurance minds right now as well. So it's very relevant that we're doing this right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's dig in a little bit more. So we've touched on a lot, obviously, with the importance of consent management, but let's dig into it a little bit more. And this question can be for either of you, whoever wants to take it first, but what are some of the key reasons why managing consumer consent is so critical for businesses today? And we can use an example of like ad tech industry or whatever you want to use, but whoever wants to dive into that first.
After you, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ad tech piece is interesting. I think, right, there's the obvious answer to this, which is some of the things we just touched on, right? Which certainly you have compliance obligations, and managing against those compliance obligations is critical to protecting your business from actions and bad press and violating user privacy. There's great research that Google has done regularly and published with an independent third party on consumer sentiment towards how businesses prioritize privacy, and really powerful data that shows actually surprisingly likely consumers are to switch to a secondary choice brand if they believe that it's more privacy respecting their primary choice brand. There's a lot of good reasons why privacy is good for business and good for minimizing enforcement action against the entities we work for. But I think especially for businesses, since you touched on it, in the ad tech landscape or who have ad tech tooling on their site, that is like putting gas on the fire, right? If you have, I'm trying to think of an example on the opposite. Some companies that are in, let's say someone in manufacturing or in a traditional B2B space that is doing very little direct marketing, very little tech running on the site, except maybe some functional analytics tooling, and their site's very static. It's a front page for their website. Absolutely. The risk profile for that is different. The level of scrutiny or anxiety that you need to have around the process on that website, certainly you still have to make sure you're being compliant. But when you get into some of these areas that involve a lot more utilization of the end user data, for targeting purposes, for analytics purposes. Now there's a lot of site behavior analytics where people are doing heat maps and constant analysis of the way people are hovering and visiting across the full site. Those sorts of activities, and then of course sharing that data with those third parties. Yes, the consent principles are the same. It's the same as for that basic manufacturing website. You still have to have consent to do that. That hasn't changed. That isn't more complex. It's still the same rule. But the reality of regulating it is much, much, much more complicated because the tools change. People don't realize this because most of us aren't developers or web developers, and most of us don't think about the way these scripts work on the site. This isn't like when you put a piece of software on your computer and you have to get the pop-up and ignore the pop-up for 3 weeks and then finally hit, okay, I'll update, right? It keeps asking me to update. I guess I'll update that piece of software and restart my computer. When you put a script on your site, that script phones home. That script loads back to its home CDN for the service provider that's providing it, and it can update itself whenever it wants. It can download new code. It can change the way it's executing on your site. That's why some of our, our CISOs and our developers and the people we work with can be fairly cautious about what we're allowed to put on the site and what JavaScript is allowed to run on the site, because these things are very dynamic, and major ad tech players release updates to their scripts constantly. The Facebook script is very, very regularly updated, and they A, B, C, D, E, F test it in different regions, and everyone's getting different variants of that script. So when you think about the number of variables that are constantly changing in that tech stack on your website that is emitting user data at the end of the day, most of the time, that is a much, much more sensitive environment to do business in with user data. So that's why I think not just having if we dial back the clock, we can't just be in the 2017, 2018, GDPR is a new big thing. We need a check the box compliant solution that cookies are a thing. We should tell e-privacy is a thing. We should tell users about cookies and make sure we have a banner that tells them about that, and try not to fire those scripts if they say no. Like, this is a whole new world, right? You've got Google consent mode. Jamal referenced the IAB TCF and GPP modes. If you're using those, you have other first-party integrations that frankly aren't even that well adopted because not everyone knows about it. Like Facebook has their limited data use parameter. All of these things help us maximize the value of the tooling we've decided to accept risk and put on our site at the cost of complicating our consent landscape. And in an ideal world, your consent vendor should be taking most of that nuance off your hands. If you're in a world where you're feeling like that's all getting pushed back on your team, on your developers, and you're having to constantly spin web dev cycles and marketing cycles being like, hey, marketing, you actually can't change the stack that way. Or, hey, the way you updated your tag manager in Telium or Adobe Experience Manager or Google Tag Manager and you wanted to rearrange those different workspaces, don't do that. It breaks the way our CMP is working. It breaks the way our ban is working. If you're becoming the bottleneck on that process and are feeling kind of on your foot with updates, that's the wrong way. That's kind of the legacy way of doing this. I really encourage you. The landscape has changed a lot, and consent tooling can and should do most of this for you on an automatic basis without requiring additional developer sprints. So, anyways, I'm getting on my soapbox again. I'm really, it's just getting to work with our customers all the time and seeing their eyes kind of click and light up as they realize, oh, hey, it doesn't have to be that way. That it's been the last couple of years where marketing dreads the email from me because I've broken something on their site or I'm a bottleneck. So, really encourage you to think about the way that your business prioritizes an omnichannel user experience with a rapidly evolving conversion funnel because of the growth and revenue your business needs. Make your privacy program match that, not only because it will make you a better partner to that part of your business, but it will help you be compliant in a lower friction way. All right, that's my 2 cents on that one.
That was great, Sean. Thank you. I don't know where do you add to that, but essentially, when I'm going and looking at a privacy program, when I'm helping some of our clients, what I'd run in my mind is my C5 framework, and some of you might have heard me speak about it on podcasts and webinars before. But look, the first thing I need is clarity. If I don't know what's going on, then how can I have any confidence in the advice or the guidance that I'm giving? And if I don't have any confidence in that, then how is the business going to find me credible? Forget the business. How are users, people using the site, the other stakeholders, going to have any credibility in our program and any of our solutions? So those 3 C's are completely gone out the window, first of all. Then the 4th C is compliance. So clarity, confidence, credibility, compliance. If you don't have any of those things, how can you be credible and say that you're compliant, or how can you actually achieve that compliance? So you're not doing what you're set out to achieve, which is achieve compliance. And the fifth C is all about community. That's the users, that's the experience. So how are we actually building trust with our community? And if we're not building trust with them, then we failed all of those C's. So what am I actually doing, right? And it all comes down to the beginning of getting that clarity. And the challenge with clarity with some of these other tools that we see out there, or that I've used in the past, is tells me what happened at some point in history. And that could be 6 months ago, that could be 12 months ago, it could be as recent as this week if I'm lucky. What I really need is a tool that will do that scanning for me while I'm sleeping and let me know of anything that's changed, anything that I need to address, anything that needs to come up. And that's why I really love speaking with Sean, is because he's come up with a way that it will tell me what's going on and I can inform you. Like, I'm a privacy consultant. I'm focused on operations. I'm not a tech. I'm not a developer. I don't need to know, and I don't want to know how any of that stuff works. What I want to know is, hey, these are the things that I need to do to achieve compliance, to make sure I need clarity so I can confidently come up with pragmatic solutions and guidance for my clients that is credible and it helps us achieve compliance. So if Sean can actually feed me that information, then I know what I need to go and do, and we can then work together to make sure that we achieve user trust and transparency, which helps us to have a credible business, a credible website, and also enhance an experience for everyone, which is also going to reduce some of the costs that we have, reduce the risk of getting enforced, and also increase the trust and the perceptions that people have when they come and visit our site and when they think about working with us.
Yeah, to both of your points, I don't know if you guys use this term, but it's culture. I mean, it has to come from the top. If we want anything to change and get better, our leaders at the top have to instill that culture and the privacy and just being able to put more resources into privacy teams. And I think we're starting to see that kind of evolve, and it's going to get better and better as more laws come out. So it's good to see. I think I'm curious from both your point of views what you think some potential, like what are some potential consequences that you've seen, maybe Jamal, working with other organizations when it comes to failing to manage consent properly or effectively? What are some of the things that people can look out for they might be seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the one that concerns people the most is reputation. Like, it can be very embarrassing if someone calls you out, or if you're going to do a deal with somebody, or you're doing a partnership, or there's some kind of a buy-in or buyout, and someone calls you out on it. It's very embarrassing. And reputation is something that businesses put so much time, effort, and energy in building, and you can just lose it like that. The other thing is, if you don't have a good reputation, if you can't win the customer's trust, because people are very familiar with their privacy choices and settings now. It's not like it was a few years ago where everyone kind of ignored it and pop-up banners were actually something that people found annoying. People still find it annoying, but people are more clued in and people are more interested in what's happening with their data now. So the challenge is you will lose the trust of your customers. You will have a negative effect on your reputation, and also with what's happening with the insurance industry now, you'll find that your costs are significantly going up, and all of that's going to come together to cause a lot of headache, which you can actually pay a little bit of attention to and turn it into a benefit.
Yeah. And going to the chat here, thanks for your question, Ebrit. Jamal, if you get a chance, we can do this like at the end of the show, but she's asking for the link to that scanning tool you referenced. Or if you have the name of it again, to just share that again.
So it was released by the European Data Protection Board. It should be on their website. I will have a look to see if I can find the link for it by the time we're done.
Yeah.
We can definitely include some resources in the follow-up email too. Maybe we can throw it in there.
Yeah. Thanks for your questions. Keep them coming. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So need to haves, basic consent management. Let's talk about going a little bit further beyond. You've touched on it a couple times, talking about legacy tools and things like that. So people might be familiar with those type of legacy tools like OneTrust or whatever. But when we're talking about the essential components of a compliant consent mechanism. Jamal, what does that look like on your end?
Challenging. So look, there's a number of tools out there. And one of our clients recently said, hey, we need some help with these cookie stuff. This is the third time we're trying to fix this. We've looked at all of the different tools available on the market, and every time we do a scan, we come back with different results, and they're all inconsistent. So there's a big challenge with what's readily available on the market. It got to a point where we actually had to commission some developers to go crawl page by page and figure out what cookies are dropping exactly based on what action. Some of those cookies sometimes will be behind gated sections of the page. Some of those will be different depending on how people are actually going in. So you need a tool that actually has full visibility globally across all of the different things that you're doing and works with all of the different technologies without breaking the site either. One of the challenges that I had a few years ago was, and I won't name the vendor, but everyone knows it's already been mentioned before, was they was dropping a script, which meant that cookies shouldn't drop before the script gets fired. And what that did is when people logged into their accounts, it stopped them from being able to see and access any of their financial information, which you can think about when it's regulated by the financial regulators is a big no-no, and that had severe consequences. So what we need to do is make sure that if we are doing something, that it doesn't break something else. And as Sean was going into the tech and talking about the scripts and all of this stuff, just a little comma or a space bar or a full stop can cause havoc. And it's not always easy to try and detect where that error has come from either. So I would say it's challenging to find a tool that is actually trustworthy, because if you can do the same scan at the same time with a different tool and you come back with different results. But I was like, why am I getting different results? Why is there such a big difference in what I'm seeing here and here? And why is this coming up on this one and not this one? But then it's coming up on another one. So they're all inconsistent. And that was my biggest challenge with some of the, especially the free tools, was they weren't comprehensive enough. And for me, again, there's no clarity, which means there's no confidence, which means I can't have a credible solution that says we've achieved compliance.
Yeah. Sean, I'm curious on your take. If you want to add on to that, I was thinking of diving into another question, but I'm curious if you want to add to.
No. Yeah, go for it. I'm just laughing because I stole the thunder of the slide a little bit. I spoke to some of this on the previous slide. Too passionate.
It's okay.
There's definitely more to add here.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to like, how can a business ensure that they provide, users with granular control over their actual data usage preferences?
Yeah. So there's a range here, right? So I think a couple things. One is, obviously, this is something we're pretty used to in a GDPR context, even if it's just kind of the classic range of essential advertising, functional, like the way we often tend to think about GDPR consent. And in some ways that's set like a little bit of a bar for like, oh, well, this is the way you define user consent. It doesn't have to be that way. The goal is that you should be describing and giving granular choice to the extent it's meaningful to end users. And there's a spectrum on which that goes, into which I think what I encourage everyone to do is look at your business, look at your relevant regulatory regimes, and find the right point on that spectrum. On the very far end of the granularity side, you have something like the TCF framework, which is like you should exhaustively disclose nuanced, a dozen plus sub-purposes and special features and special purposes across every granular disclosed vendor on this. How much does that benefit the end user? And does that make the end user feel empowered and like they understand what's happening? I think is an open conversation, let's say, right? I think there's a lot of users that hit that and are like, wow, now I feel a little bit lousy because you've told me that there's 700 vendors processing my data, but also I don't understand what I'm seeing. So I'm still just going to click one of the big buttons at the bottom. So, right. So and I think the thing I would add, not tongue in cheek on that front, is take seriously the recent IAB guidance from IAB Europe on the TCF front, which is don't default to just adding all TCF vendors. That used to kind of be the standard, was you just added the full vendor list because it was hard to figure out how not to. In their recent conversations with the authorities and their ongoing back and forth over the compliance of the TCF framework, they now have some pretty strongly worded guidance that says you should really, really not just necessarily default. They haven't said you can't default to adding all vendors, but they really encourage publishers and advertisers to actually understand the vendors in their advertising supply chain and to try to scope that list down to what can be reasonably understood by an end user. And I think that's a good exercise. It can be a challenging exercise, but again, without going too much into the weeds of TCF, because it is kind of niche, I would just say work with your advertising publisher partners on that front. So for example, if you're using Google for your advertising publishing supply chain, they have functionality in their advertising product to help you understand the vendors that they're tapping to work with as part of the supply chain for delivering your ads. So you can kind of draw from that to scope down your TCF list and try to make it a little less overwhelming. So that's the super granular side. On the other side, you have what we often see in the US, which is a single choice. It's like, hey, we use your data. Hopefully you're okay with that, right? Like close this little banner or hit the link of the button if you don't want to at the bottom, or tell us to stop selling or sharing your data. And the thing I would call out on that front, which again, haven't seen a lot of movement or traction, that may change in the next couple of years. But as you look at the way, for example, CPRA, the most recent amendments to CCPA in California, which kind of sets the bar for the US, are written, there's clear guidance in the regulation that you can offer more granular choices beyond just don't sell or share my data. They say like it's okay to break that down further if you want to give the user additional choices. I have yet to see a compelling example of that being done. I don't think that will stay the case. I think that as the regulators get a little more intense, as we get better informed about the way users perceive do not sell share functionality, I think that we may start to see more on that front, where we actually see some more granularity in the more US centric interfaces. The other thing I would say on granular data control and kind of up-leveling it to this idea of how should we handle talking about these things with visitors to our website is just because we have a hammer, which is a cookie banner, does not mean every consent problem is a nail. And what we've seen a lot, unfortunately, I think for end users and the marketing and the broader business, is a lot of companies have just defaulted to using a proactive banner across their sites in the US. And as someone who develops a CMP solution, please, like, yes, we have banners. You don't necessarily always need to use those. Sit down and really look, whether it's yourself, whether it's working with outside counsel, however it works. You may be surprised how you don't necessarily need that banner to still get your notice of disclosure, to still feel disclosed and to not be bothering those end users needlessly. Proactive banners in the EU are, I think, in some ways have set back privacy in some ways in terms of perception for end users, because privacy became equated with this thing that got really annoying on the internet. So to the extent that we can avoid bringing that to another whole set of hundreds of millions of consumers is great. And when you look at the regulation, when you look at the guidance from the regulators, they talk about a frictionless experience. They talk about footer links. They talk about silently honoring signals. They don't talk about every user should see a banner when they first land on your home page. So as you think about yourself as a good partner to your business and marketing partners, how happy would they be if you told them, hey, I don't need to add a 20% bounce layer to our conversion funnel by showing every user in the US, or at least in some states in the US, that banner. So again, work with your CMP, work with counsel, but I think more often than not, we could be defaulting to using the footer link and the lower friction approaches where possible to which is giving that user, it's respecting their intent to visit the site while still giving them the ability to honor their privacy choices in the way the regulators have said are important. The other thing I would add quickly, if I can, on this one, Cameron, different topic, but the first bullet here, because I didn't explicitly hit on this earlier. So when we say real-time visibility and this concept of going beyond basic consent management, this goes back to that topic of you can't manage what you can't see, what you don't know exists on your site. And if your knowledge of what exists on your site is limited to a subset of pages that a cookie scanner is hitting every couple of weeks or something, or worse, like a self-attested list from marketing where, marketing's like, oh yeah, here's a spreadsheet. These are the six tools we use. You have gaps, right? It's not really a question of you have gaps. Like, you have gaps. It's how big those gaps are. Like, that's just the reality of having a modern website. So up-leveling that to something that is more real-time and that is much more robust across every page is huge. Transcend's approach to this, which is pretty unique, is that we sample off aggregated anonymous telemetry data off actual site sessions across the website. So if it's firing for a user, it will show up and you will see it as a script or a cookie. So again, not just relying on a robot crawler, visiting a page of the site and seeing what cookies land, but saying, hey, deep in the e-commerce funnel on a logged in page at the checkout step, we're seeing this tag fired for end users that nobody knew the web conversion team or the product team responsible for that part of the e-commerce funnel put on that checkout page. Well, it's something that a traditional static cookie scanner would never find. But because from a tooling standpoint, we're sampling off actual telemetry data, you can get continuously updated on what's running across every page of the site and get notified, right? Get that ping in your Slack, get that email notification when a new undetected service that's recognized as sharing user data is discovered running on the site. So that paired with an audit type tool is huge. And certainly there's use cases that make this more pronounced, right? If you're dealing with sensitive data or health data, if you've been at all like part of a SIPR or a wiretapping plaintiff action, or like there's use cases that make this even more pronounced. But I think every business, just like how we have ROPAs, just like how we have assessments in place to understand processing activities, every privacy practitioner should be able to say that they have a very solid understanding of what is running across the entire site at any given point in time, because otherwise, how do you explain mitigation of those risks? So that's my bet on real-time visibility. Otherwise, I think we hit most of this really well.
Mm-hmm. If Jamal, you don't have anything, we'll jump to the next one because we still
Let's
got.
go.
Yeah, let's. So just to give everybody a visual, we've all heard of these. Obviously, we know these large companies. This kind of gives you a visual of an example and a lesson that they went through. You know, Facebook, Amazon, TikTok. But one that probably wasn't talked about very much is a retailer called Sephora, which is pretty interesting. But I'm curious to hear from both of you in your opinion on what some of the mistakes these companies made, and maybe some of the lessons that can be learned here for everybody listening.
I think the key mistake they all made was not paying enough attention to what's actually happening across their sites, not paying enough attention to what Cameron's friends are doing in the marketing teams and how that data is being used, and also not giving the users enough respect to ask for their permission before they do certain things. It's a little bit like Cameron. So if I came to you and I said, Cameron, can I take $50 from your wallet? And you say no, and I'll be like, well, I'm going to take it anyway. And this is essentially what they was doing, is they was asking people to consent to certain things. They wasn't really following through on the purposes of what the people were consenting to, and is doing what they wanted with people's data. And that's what the key challenge was. So there was, and the reason that happened was not because these companies set out to do that, right? They're honest mistakes, they're genuine mistakes. And you know, they're probably more distraught about what actually happened and how it's impacted the people that they care about, their customers who pay their bills and really help them do all of those things, and some other people. But it was because there was a lack of clarity. And why was there a lack of clarity? Well, perhaps they didn't have the right tool or the right resources to be able to help them. If there was no clarity, then there was no confidence in anything they were doing, which means the program wasn't credible. The consent permissions they have weren't compliant, and that ultimately led to the reputational damage that you see of them not just paying the fines. I mean, fines are one thing, right? The money comes and goes, but the reputation, the goodwill, the trust that it erodes, the number of people somebody goes and tells bad news about, those are some of the things that we can't always measure. But if you look at some of the cases, let's say, for example, let's take the case of Facebook in the UK. So right around 2018, Facebook was fined the maximum at the time before the GDPR kicked in, even though the announcement was made after the GDPR came in. They was fined by the ICO 500,000. That's the maximum they could be fined, right? It took them 8 minutes in advertising revenue to pay that fine. So that wasn't such a big deal. It might be a big deal for other companies, but for them, it wasn't a big deal. But at the same time, because of that, 1 in every 3rd person in Sweden cancelled or closed their Facebook account, right? So if you think about the consequences of that and the impact that's going to have, where you've got the population the size of Sweden, that's just Sweden, that's the only stats we know. We don't know how else that impacted other people in other parts of the world. So you can see those other consequences that we can't always initially measure have far greater consequences than we would always appreciate. And that's what it's important for people on this call to appreciate is, hey, this stuff will have a massive impact, but it doesn't have to be there. Like everything in life, you're gonna pay, right? So you either pay with pain or you pay with attention. And these companies here, they didn't pay enough attention. So essentially what happened is they have to pay with pain now. But we will have a choice, and we will have the ability, and we can actually go and find the right tools to help us to pay attention, get things right, and make sure we're doing the things respectfully and ethically, so we win the trust of the people that we're looking to serve and have a greater impact with whatever it is that we're doing with our businesses.
Oh yeah. You made the point of how it wasn't that big of a deal for Facebook, but from my point of view, it was such a big deal that they had to change a name to Meta to take the attention off of what they had been doing. But Sean, is there anything that you wanted to add in there? I know offline we were talking about just Sephora in general, but is there anything that you wanted to kind of add?
Yeah, I mean, look at this list, right? One of these things is not like the other, right? You got a retailer on here with these big tech giants, and that's interesting. That was interesting at the time, made ripples when it happened, whatever this was, a year and a half ago, and I think it's still really interesting. And in terms of mistakes made, or like what the pattern here is, like, don't assume that because you're not the juicy big tech target, you're not going to get the letter, you're not going to get the tap. California AG has been particularly active on this front, but I think you're going to continue to see that across other regulatory bodies as well, where the point is that they do care about volume of user data to some extent, but it's about, in a lot of ways, it's almost a principal thing where they'll pick a sector, they'll pick retail, and they'll go through and they'll figure out who isn't doing a good job, and they'll send a whole bunch of letters, they'll send a whole bunch of taps. One thing to learn from Sephora that we know from reading the filings around this is that they didn't listen. They got a letter, and a lot of other businesses cured, and Sephora didn't, for whatever reason. They had a consent manager on their site. It wasn't working the way it should have been with respect to GPC signal, and they weren't staying up to date on what the Attorney General had said his interpretation of CCPA at the time was, and that became even more explicit with CPRA, and they didn't get in front of it. So I think assuming that you're not an attractive enough target, or that you're not the right industry, or that, what could it? No, that did not work out well for Sephora. I don't see it working out well down the line. And I think it sent the right message through the industry, which is that, look, this is a question of how you are following the regulation. If you're following the regulation, you're going to be in the clear. If you're not, you could get the letter. If you get the letter, listen to us, pay attention, fix it, cure it. And if you don't, then you may have an example made of yourself, which was the case here. So I think it is a good reminder for all of us who want to be in the middle of the pack, right? No one wants to be at the front of the pack, way pulling ahead and a juicy target. No one wants to be lagging too far behind. So calculating yourself to that risk profile is important. And then the other just takeaway I would say is don't get too far behind on the status quo. It changes fast. GPC had become a more pronounced thing for the California AG for maybe 6 months before this. My memory is a little fuzzy on the timeline because it's been a while now, but it was not like there's not a huge lag here, right? And they may have very well thought that they had this button down. They visited the consent problem, who knows however many years or months before this, and we're like, look, we're fine. It's just a letter. We're okay. We know we have this button down. That is not necessarily the case. The regulators are getting more technical. They write more technical regulations. They audit in more technical ways, and they're not scared to enforce. So approaching consent as an evolving technical challenge. Privacy is increasingly a technical discipline. The CISOs aren't alone anymore in their role as compliance people who have to be able to really understand and talk to the engineers. That is very much becoming the case for the privacy side of the world as well. And I think that's a great example here in this case study.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I appreciate that, and Jamal. So let's talk about some strategies for auditing consent management, and I'm sure we've touched on some of these already, but why don't we go ahead and start with Jamal first. From your point of view, what are some best practices for conducting audits of consent mechanisms within an organization?
Yeah, so I think number one is the information that we provide has to be clear and it has to be specific. And Sean's mentioned granularity a number of times. So what we need to make sure we're clear about is what is actually being collected, how is it going to be used, who's it going to be shared with, what is the purpose of that, and then give someone the ability to make an informed choice about whether they want that to happen with their information or not. And it's not just about providing this information in a cookie cutter template. It has to be easily understandable. So we need to avoid the technical and the legal jargon. the consent has to be freely given, especially if we're talking about it from a GDPR or a GDPR similar jurisdiction, which means that there has to be an affirmative opt-in. There can't be a precondition of a service. There can't be an inducement or a punishment if somebody doesn't actually give that consent. It has to be unambiguous, and it has to be a positive affirmative action that they take. So they have to either tick a box or click a button or do something else that indicates that this is the choice I'm making. It should be also easy to withdraw. Like, one of the things about GDPR consent, and one of the reasons Google got fined, was because it wasn't as easy to withdraw the consent as it was to give it in the first place. Record keeping, we've discussed that a lot. We need to keep detailed records, documented. Who consented? When did they consent? How did they consent? And what specifically did they actually consent to? And that's really crucial for providing compliance in the cases of audits, and especially if we get to the stage where we see lots of legal disputes, which the insurers are predicting is going to come, we need to make sure that there's regular review and updating of that. So the consent mechanism should be reviewed regularly to make sure that it remains compliant with the current laws, but also what Sean mentioned is best practices, right? We shouldn't just wait for a law, a legal thing. We need to understand what is the pulse of the public, what is the conception amongst professionals in the industry, and make sure that we're up to date with best practices. And the other challenge we haven't mentioned yet is age verification and parental consent. So if you are fortunate enough to be dealing with people who are younger, sometimes you will need to verify that that person is actually how old they say are, or verify that it's actually a parent that's given that consent. And when you work in jurisdictions where that can be a little bit challenging, and when you have different age ranges across different states, that also becomes another challenge that we need to solve as well.
Yeah. Sean, is there anything that you quickly want to add before we get to that last slide? Because I know we're getting
Nope.
on.
Big +1. I think we've hit it. Yeah.
Perfect. So benefits of an effective consent auditing, or of effective consent auditing, excuse me. Sean, let's talk a little bit about some of the advantages of maintaining an effective consent auditing process for businesses. What are your takes on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We've hit on a bunch of these, right? I referenced the studies and research around, how it impacts user behaviors and choices they make. We've talked about obviously the risks on the compliance standpoint, and adhering to the regulations. I think the only thing that I would kind of add over the top of this is that effectively auditing your consent program, and more broadly having an effective consent program. And effective means multiple things here. It not only means compliant, but it means effective in terms of maximizing the balance between compliance and providing value back to the business. Over compliance, over regulation, treating every script with a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel, not being precise and granular, does no service to your business. It minimizes the value of technology that your business is invested in, and your properties, the way you do business. So the benefits of effective consent auditing, and more broadly an effective consent program, are that you as a practitioner get to come to the table as a partner, right? The goal here is all we're doing should be in partnership with a business. As we shift away from that mindset, privacy said no. Privacy said we can't do that. Privacy said slow down. Privacy said make the website worse, right? But you want to be able to bring these things back to the business to be like, look, here's how I know we're compliant. Here's how I'm helping you maximize the value of the program. Here's the checks we're doing to make sure that I can keep telling you yes and or no but as you help them find ways to add new value. You can't be doing that if you can't be confident in your core directive, which is make sure you're not doing non-compliant activities. So you have to have this ground layer foundation of having an effective audit and consent program in place. Otherwise, you're handcuffed to bring that value back to the business. So don't do that to yourself. Understand the program, understand the risks well enough so that you can be an effective partner.
Great. That's great advice. Jamal, anything that you want to add on to that?
I thought Sean covered it very well. Two things I would like to add to that. Number one is you get to sleep better at night because there's no nasty surprises waiting. And number two is actually you can look at yourself. You can look at yourself in the eye and feel good about what you're doing. Because one of the challenges that I've had where I've worked with clients who haven't managed to figure that out is, as data privacy professionals, we want to make sure that we're looking after people's rights and we're making sure that people understand what's happening with their data. And when you don't have clarity on this, and some of this stuff is being sold for profiling and all of this other stuff, especially if you're working in the health space, you start questioning, am I even doing the right thing? Like, am I doing what I'm supposed to be? So when you get clarity, when you're confident, when you can achieve compliance and you know you've got credible solutions in place, it really helps you to feel proud of what you're doing as a company, feel proud of what you're doing as a practitioner, and say, hey, we know we've got all of this taken care of, we're doing the right thing, and we're focusing on the things that matter. And also, you're not a blocker to the business. You're helping them to do all of the things they want to do in a way that is compliant and ethical and wins the trust of all of the people that you're working with at the same time.
Awesome. Well, we are at time. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here with us today. And thank you, Sean and Jamal, for your expertise and feedback. This has been awesome. I know we had one question left in the chat here around, are you able to share some of the audit tools commonly used? I'm not sure if we we can maybe send something in chat, but I'm also going to be sending an email to all of you for this recording as well. So I can maybe put something in that email as well. So I appreciate the question. But that's pretty much it. So we really appreciate it. And I'll send it back to Selena.
All right, thank you, Cameron, and thank you, Jamal and Sean, for putting such a great program together and providing us with these valuable insights. We really appreciate it. I also want to give a big thank you to Transcend for sponsoring today's webcon, so that's free to our audience. That wraps up the program here today. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you in another IPP web conference soon.
Thank you.